Hello and welcome. I'm making this recording because I would like to have a record of my progress as I build an automatic translation application. So in this recording right now, I'm going to go through and talk about the user interface model that I have for my application. And what it is that I see when I look at this user interface model, sort of how I visualize the functionality behind the user interface that doesn't work yet. I can go through and click the buttons and nothing happens yet, even though the buttons are there. I can't add files supposedly. I've got a little bit of JS functionality there, but I just want to get a record of where it is that I'm starting, what my goals are at this time, because the goals are likely to change as well. So this is the system that I'm building. I think it will look pretty familiar to people who have worked with automatic translation before. But let's start with the title up here. It's not a title that I'm completely thrilled with yet, though it is illustrative. The title of the project is Corpus Graph Document Translation. What that's meant to mean is that I'm working on an automatic translation system where my hypothesis is that if I integrate large language models within this system to carry out translation, the output of those large language models can be improved if I connect some specialized resources with the content or with the system. So one of the first things I would be connecting would be specialized corpora for the subject fields in which the system is going to be available. I'll also be incorporating knowledge graphs of terminological data within the subject fields that the system will be available in. And then this document piece is really important because with this system, I would like to depart from the typical translation model of having this status quo approach where when you work in translation technology, when you work in translation environment tools, we see a sentence by sentence approach. And the sentence by sentence approach is not how language works. But first, let me describe the sentence by sentence approach for anyone who may be watching who is unfamiliar with how translation environment tools work. In the traditional sentence by sentence approach, what a translation environment tool, a computer assisted translation tool does is you take your document, you upload it to the system, and it parses out the sentences into different cells of essentially a bilingual table. So you'll have your source column on one side, your target column on the other side, and then there are rows. In each of those rows, in the source column side, you have the source sentence. In the target column side, you have the target sentence. I like to think of these as jail cells for the content, because the content ends up being decontextualized when we follow that methodology. The translator, despite the fact that they're maybe seeing sentence by sentence in a row, the work is still contextualized because a person cognitively is only focusing on one sentence at a time, filling in that corresponding jail cell in the bilingual table with the target content. Other problems with this approach is not just how it influences the cognitive work of translators, but also how it prevents pragmatic equivalence in translation. So I just got finished reading Mona Baker's chapter on pragmatic equivalence from In Other Words. This is a textbook on translation. And Baker talks about the fact that when we're thinking about pragmatic equivalence, it will often require, a complete rewriting, revisualization of what a text is presenting. To give an example from Baker's chapter, Baker notes that in academic writing in German, it's very common to have, the topic sentence, some discussion, a very long digression, another very long digression, a return to the previous digression, a return to the previous topic, which requires some repetition, because as you're transitioning back to previous topics that you were talking about, in order to orient the audience, you need to repeat some of the information that was previously that was previously stated. And so this would be something that maybe I, as an English reader, reading a literal or a more conventional translation of German content, I might find this to be unnecessarily convoluted, just because of my cultural and the cultural situation. At the same time, if a German reader reads one of my academic papers where, maybe I'm following the approach that's often taken in English, where there's a topic sentence and then I go into my details, but I stick to the topic, right? And they would probably, or maybe find the content lacking in depth. So if we really want to have pragmatic equivalence, there needs to be some rewriting that takes place, some addition of content that takes place, some omission of content that takes place. And that's not possible under the configuration that we have within translation environment tools, where there's this very strict sentence by sentence matching. I know from experience as well that when going through translation and localization workflows, a step is not included after, typically not included after, translation, editing, proofreading within the translation environment tool, to do that rewriting, to do that work to ensure pragmatic equivalence. So that's just why, for me, taking a whole document approach is something that's really important. I would prefer my system to take, the whole content, produce a translation, and to produce a translation that has pragmatic equivalence along with the other types of equivalence that we're looking for. So let's do a walkthrough of the system. I'll do 2 walkthroughs of the system right now, where during the first walkthrough I would like to sort of hit the major points, and then during the second walkthrough I'll add some nuance. But obviously the system starts with an area where you would add your source content. So the source content can be uploaded in document format. It can be pasted here. The window will expand depending on how much content there is. I'm going to have to build in functionality for very long content in order to maybe be able to view it on a page-by-page view or something like that. But once the content is uploaded, the person hits Analyze Content, and then we go to an analysis stage. We don't go straight to having the translation output produced. And this is important because, we need to establish the specifications first. Establishing the specifications first is a best practice. It's a requirement of the international standard ASTM F2575, standard practice for language translation. And so my system is going to incorporate specifications. And what's going to happen with those specifications? Well, there's going to be some automatic analysis that takes place. So I'll upload my content. The system will compare the content to the corpora that I have built into the system in order to situate the content within its subject field. At this point, I have corpora on translation and localization. I'm also working on corpora. I have corpora on generative AI, and I would like to add a third set of corpora on Mexico and US relations as well. That might have to wait a little bit as I work on the prioritized features that I have. So essentially what would happen is the system will analyze the content, situate it within a subject field. If it's content that does not come from a subject field that has a corresponding corpus within the system, then some sort of a message will pop up saying, hey, listen, this content, our system isn't optimized for this content. You'll need to go to another automatic translation engine. Later, automatic source specifications like language variant, text type, purpose, etc. will also be established. These are going to have drop-down menus just in case the system makes a mistake and the user would like to make some slight adjustments. But let's, in this case, imagine that we have these specifications. The content, it's been uploaded, it's in the domain of translation and localization. The system determines that it's in the language variant of English for the United States. It's a blog post. It's meant to be persuasive. So the single blog post is meant to get someone to take action, or the blog post is a part of a long series of blog posts designed to help to take people through the sales funnel of just, having brand awareness, having interest, and then being ready to make a purchase. So it's written by a copywriter from the point of view of a copywriter. The audience is potential clients, and the reach is regional. There's many different reaches that we could be trying to obtain: global, regional, local, something that's for information purposes only. Each of these levels also represents risk in the process, where if something is being published for a much wider audience and it will impact a brand, that's something that has higher risk than content that's just for information purposes. Over on the target side, the system will make some recommendations as well. The system that I'm envisioning is an American system, a system for the American continents, or the American continent, depending on which part of the world that you're from. In the United States, we see, which is my background, we see continents, the American continents, as being 2 to 3 separate continents, wherein the other regions, actually this whole hemisphere, this whole part of the world, is seen as a single American continent. So if someone is dropping in content that's English for the United States, it's either going to be going for Mexico or Latin America, and the system can make a recommendation on that. When it comes to the text type, what kind of translation is this going to be? In this case, we have a lot of choices. So in this case, since I know that it's a blog post, it's meant to be persuasive, I'm probably going to want a localization or a transcreation. I'm going to want something that really speaks with and engages the target audience. I think it's unfortunate that the meaning of localization has become so watered down that now we need terminology like hyper-localization, hyper-personalization, even transcreation to talk about the work that used to be conceptualized by the term localization. While it's a term that has referred to the rendering of software applications, it's also a term that has meant to convey that the content is being made local for a specific audience. And so that unfortunately has gotten pretty watered down. And so in this case, I'm going to choose that I want a transcreation. I want somebody to, feel free to change the content or the system, in this case, to feel free to creatively, change the content in order to achieve the goal of persuasion, to achieve the voice of a copywriter, understanding that the audience are clients or potential clients, and again, understanding that we want a regional reach here. So once those settings have been established, I can click Proceed with Translation. The system will go on to not only produce the translation, but also to give me some metrics on performance metrics on how the system performed. So this is a piece that I'm really interested in because, as I stated at the start of this recording, my hypotheses are that if you add corpora, or I should say integrate corpora, knowledge graphs, and knowledge graphs into the translation system, you're going to get a better output. If you take a whole document level approach, you're going to get a better output. And so I would like to see some performance metrics on that. I would like to see on a scale from 0 to 100%, what was the influence that the, whatever corpora that were drawn upon, what was the influence that they had on the translation output. For the terminology, from 0 to 100, what was the influence that that terminology had on the translation? How often is it used? And then on the document level analysis, and this is important, what's the coherence of the translation? Coherence is a topic addressed by Mona Baker in her chapter on pragmatic equivalence. For coherence, we have coherence on 2 levels. Number 1, is the document coherent within the document itself? Does it make sense how the document transitions from paragraph to paragraph? Is the connection among the ideas presented clear? On the other hand, we also have coherence that's on a much larger scale. Is the document coherent with the universe of texts that are written within a subject field? Is the document coherent with the societal expectations that correspond to the language in which it has been produced? And so here I'm looking for, how is the coherence of the document from a scale of 0 to 100? And I think this piece is going to be especially interesting as well, because if, we think about the large language models and the content that they have been trained upon, it's supposedly all of the content on the internet. And if it's all of the content on the internet, and we consider that a lot of the content on the internet is not that great of writing, and a lot of the content on the internet, if it's a translation, it's probably a translation that has followed a sentence by sentence approach. Can this system of incorporating corpora and setting up the system to follow a document level approach, can that override the biases and tendencies of the large language models? We'll see. So in effect, next, the translation would be produced here, available for download. Again, I would need to build in some sort of a system for viewing longer content. But here I would like to give users the possibility of also carrying out some analysis on the quality of the translation. So following the MQM core typology, MQM is another standard. This is a very standards-based approach that I'm taking. The multi-dimensional quality metrics, where a lot of work has been done to identify translation errors, to build them into a typology. And so I would like to have people able to go through and mark errors in the translation, following an annotation approach where a span of text would be highlighted, the person would click on the span of text and assign an error to it. Maybe include some comments and things like that. What's interesting is that if that functionality is built into the system, then that also becomes a feedback loop within the system, because as individuals are marking spans of text with errors, the system is learning from those errors, what not to do the next time around. However, on the other hand, I think it's important that the system also have methodologies for determining the quality of the evaluation provided. So it's sort of a chicken in the egg situation where a person can rank the quality of the evaluation, but then we also need to rank the quality of that person's quality evaluation. At the end of the document, or at the end of the interface, if we're thinking about the user getting to the end of their journey through the system, they would be able to, and will be able to, mark rate the overall quality of the translation, again, as a whole document, because I think in translation we've been overly concerned with making sure that, every single sentence has its corresponding sentence in its little jail cell in the CAT tools. And we need to move beyond that to approach that that considers translations as a whole text, which means also ranking and rating translations on a whole text level. These two axes, correspondence and readability, come from another standard, from ASTM F43, a standards technical committee that writes standards on translation, where the system, as it stands now, it's a draft standard, has two axes for rating overall quality. Those are correspondence and readability. Correspondence is an interesting one because when we're thinking about correspondence, the meaning of correspondence will shift depending on the specifications that we have set. So if I've set that my translation should be a transcreation, obviously my correspondence, as I think about it, it needs to be a concept that's more free, right? I'm not going to get correspondence on a sentence by sentence level. I'm not even going to get correspondence maybe on a paragraph by paragraph or a whole document level in the traditional sense. But as long as there's that, core idea, the core purpose of the text being conveyed in the transcreation, then I would be able to rate something as having an excellent level of correspondence. Likewise, if I'm going for something that's more of a conventional translation, where I do want to see more of a relationship, easily identified relationship among things like sentences, paragraphs, sections, etc., then correspondence has a more strict sense. And then, of course, readability. We want to have readability of the content as a standalone document. So that's sort of the initial walkthrough of the system. There's a couple other pieces that I want to touch upon. Also understanding that I'll be able to touch upon these in future records that I keep about this system. But first of all, I'd like to talk about sort of this corpus approach and why that's a good practice when we're thinking about large language models. So there's a great article written by Timnit Gebru on wanting tech companies to think small when they're building large language models. And why is that? And this is also a best practice of corpora management. When we think about corpora management, at least when I think about it from a traditional sense, from a translation perspective, when I'm building corpora for the purposes of translation work and terminology work, there are some best practices or good practices that I need to follow. Some of those good practices include actually having a record of what's in the corpus. Large language models don't have that, or maybe they do have that and they don't want to share it because they've scraped so much copywritten information from the internet and taken whole repositories of books and just plugged them into the system without getting permission from, nor without compensating anyone. But a best practice of corpora management is understanding the content that's in the corpus. So that involves recording metadata. What's the title of the document? Where did it come from? Who wrote it? Part of this tracking is also important to manage the health of a corpus. So for a corpus to be reliable, it needs to be balanced. And balanced means that, well, if I'm building an IT corpus and I only include documents from Microsoft, I don't have a balanced corpus. I have a Microsoft corpus, not an IT corpus. So balance is something that we need to achieve in our corpora, not only on sort of this organizational level where we're looking at what organizations have published the content that I'm putting into the corpus, but also on an individual level. Am I including a demographically diverse set of authors in my corpus in order to ensure that the terminology that's being used, the stylistic conventions that are being used, reflect consensus among a community of subject matter experts about how an area of specialization is communicated about. So that's an important piece. And that's a piece I'm going to be looking at in the next week, the next couple of weeks, when I'm working on, developing this application. I also wanted to touch upon the languages of this system. I chose initially to work with English for the United States and Spanish Mexico because I'm from the United States. I'm currently living in Mexico, and these two dialects of English are therefore dialects that I'm comfortable with. I understand to a greater or lesser degree the nuance behind these dialects, or I have the resources at my disposal in order to be able to understand the nuance behind these dialects. However, I also had to expand my corpus for Spanish, or sort of not the corpus. I had to expand my approach to how I was building corpora for Spanish. And this is because if I think about the fields that I'm working on right now, working on integrating into this system, I've selected translation and localization, generative artificial intelligence, and for these two subject fields, there's not as much written in Mexican Spanish specifically. In Spanish, there's a lot of content on translation and localization from Spain, from Argentina. There's not as much from Mexico. And so in order to be able to produce corpora of the size that I need to produce, I had to expand my parameters a little bit. But that's okay, because within the metadata that I collect about the documents that I'm including in my corpora, I can simply tag different pieces of literature with the specific variant from which they come. And as I build up resources that are larger and larger, I can integrate more specificity into the system. Speaking of specifications, as long as we're on this section here, I also wanted to talk a little bit more about how the specifications impact the output that is being produced. So in this case, the imaginary project that was established was a blog post that's meant to be persuasive. It's meant to be written from the point of view from a copywriter. And so wanting to have those same effects with the target culture, the text type for the translation was established as a transcreation. We've got, a purpose that's persuasive. It should be written from the point of view of a copywriter. Now let's imagine another scenario where this time we want to have a translation of the target content that was produced that helps us to understand what were the claims made in the original blog post. Because something has happened, a person bought a product because they were very compelled by the writing, by the marketing of the company to buy the product, by the fantastic claims they were reading. But then it turned out that the product didn't actually do what the company said it could do. So now, maybe this has escalated a great deal. We're now in a court system where someone is being sued, or a company is being sued because their product was not up to par. This is going to change how we approach the project, right? Because now when we're looking perhaps at the original and we're trying to understand what were the claims that were made, this is going to change very much our specifications, where now our text type, we might want to have a back translation of the Spanish. We might want to have a literal translation of the English to be able to understand how the claims that were made in the Spanish target relate to what was actually claimed in the English source. Even conventional translation might work, but let's go for a literal translation of our English this time. The purpose of our text is going to change. Now it's informative. because a court system is using the translation to understand and make a decision about the veracity of a person's lawsuit. The point of view changes as well. Courts tend to respect and look for the opinions of subject matter experts. And of course, the the audience changes as well. Now we have a regulatory audience, and our reach changes as well. So obviously the text that is produced from these specifications should differ a great deal from the text that was produced from the previous set of specifications. And that's an important piece to keep in mind when working with automatic translation. Can the system actually respond to specifications? And let's see if I can build a system that can. The last point I would like to make is about knowledge graphs. I'm very excited about knowledge graphs these days. Just getting started with them. I'm just getting us started with a lot of this, just getting started with web development, application development, and so I'm doing a lot of new things a lot of the time right now, which is very exciting, very frustrating at times. You know, the work is a little bit slower than I would like it to be, but it's also great to be doing new things. When thinking about knowledge graphs and the traditional approach to term bases, so a term base is essentially like that bilingual table I was talking about earlier, where in its simplest form, you've got your source column, your target column. You put the source, or they shouldn't even be source and target. It should be English, maybe column. I'll say English because English is my dominant language. Then we've got another column in Spanish. I'll say pick Spanish in this case because Spanish is my non-dominant language, and you just plug the terms in, right? Well, what tends to happen with this approach is that we do think of it as a source and target language. You just heard me make that mistake, even though I'm very aware that that terminology work is not a process of translation. And so what typically happens is the terminology will be built in what's considered to be the source language first. In this case, let's assume that that source language is English. Next, the Spanish terminology would just be plugged in. It's like, oh, we've got 10 terms in English, let's plug in the 10 equivalent terms in Spanish. What this means is that the English conceptual systems are being forced upon whatever other languages are in the term base. And I'm sure I'll get into this much more deeply later on as I'm going through and keeping records of my work here developing this app. But if you think about what's the purpose of a term base really is meant to teach humans what are the relationships around concepts and to ensure that the correct terminology is used for different concepts. So in English, if I have a concept system that's reflected in my term base through the inclusion of terms like translation on a broader level, and then types of translation, including conventional translation and back translation, that's the concept system that has derived from how English thinks about, how people who speak English think about translation. And maybe there's a different conceptual system in Spanish, but because the English has been recorded first, any Spanish terms that get plugged in are assumed to have the exact same conceptual structure as the English language, which is, not the case. What's also interesting about working with term bases, if we think about having all of our terminology in a term base, and then we use something like a quality control check within the translation environment tools to make sure that the correct terminology was used. What those automatic checks are doing, they're not checking to make sure that the use of terminology makes sense. They're checking to make sure that a literal alphabetic string was used in the target. So if I have A, B, C, D as a term in the source, it's going to look for A, B, C, D somewhere in the target. It doesn't matter if that term makes sense there. It doesn't matter if, the conceptual structures of the ideas that are being conveyed are different, so a different term doesn't use. The system is just looking for strict letter by letter matching. So if we think about that knowledge graph system once again, knowledge graphs are really exciting, a really exciting way to teach large language models about semantic meaning. And and as much as large language models can't understand meaning, they don't understand meaning, they are able to calculate relationships among ideas as expressed in language. And so what's exciting about taking a knowledge graph approach is that, and I've done some initial testing on this as well, is that I can build up my terminology on the English side and have the concept system represented there. I can then go and build up my terminology on the Spanish side and have my concept system represented there. And then I can link only the concepts that have full correspondence, that have full equivalence. And I'd like to put a little asterisk next to full correspondence and full equivalence, because when you're working with two different languages, two different language systems, that reflect two different cultural systems, two different organization systems for societies, you're never going to have full correspondence. You're never going to have full equivalence. But let's set that aside for now and say, okay, yes, we determine that there are at least some concepts that have so-called full correspondence. Those would be the ones that are connected in the knowledge graph, and we wouldn't be forcing connections where no connections exist. So I think that the knowledge graph approach represents a much more ethical way of modeling concepts and the terminology that represents concepts in terminological resources. Beyond that, I think that's probably plenty for now. I guess what I'll say in conclusion is that I've started to, in my web development course, we've looked at agile project management a couple weeks ago. I found that to be very inspirational. I taught project management for 6 years, and I maybe had overestimated my understanding of things related to project management. I was certainly aware of agile processes and sprints and things like that. It was a nice reminder to go through and read a little bit about agile project management to gain the understanding or the reminder that the purpose of agile project management within software and application development is to actually put an application out there, to prioritize the most important features and put an application out there. So that's my goal right now, is to actually put an application out there, just building in the most basic features into my system, understanding that I'll be able to build it up from there. So in my board, I've got areas that I'm brainstorming. These are things where I can think of all of the nice to haves that I would love to have in my system. But then the pieces that get prioritized are the pieces that I actually need in order to produce a working system. So that's where I'm at. If you've watched this recording, thank you for following along. I would love to get any feedback that you have on producing applications. As I said, this is new to me, so any advice or recommendations is most welcome. And yeah, until next time.